But the influences you may hear include Lisa Lowe's Intimacy of Four Continents, Sage Hartman's Venus in Two Acts, T.D. Miles' All That She Carried, Jessica Marie Johnson's fabulous essay, Markup Bodies, Emma Rothschild's work on microhistory, and Lionel Hughes Watkins' work on reparative archives. So feel free to ask me more about those people should their work interest you. 2023, as many of you know, was the centenary of the passage of Canada's Chinese Immigration Act, which bans the entry into Canada of all immigrants from China, with few exceptions. This act was the culmination of nearly 40 years of anti-Chinese policies that began with the imposition of a head tax after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was the first legislation in Canadian history to limit immigration on the basis of ethnic background. So in 1885, a $50 tax was imposed, but by 1903, it had gone up to $500, which was the equivalent of 2 years of wages for a laborer. These racist policies dramatically impeded the formation of Chinese families in Canada, limiting the number of marriageable Chinese women and children in Canada, and separating men from their family in China, which meant that many died alone in bachelor communities in Canada, or barely knew their children when they were reunited after the repeal of the exclusion laws in 1947. So my talk today focuses on two remarkable but quite different families who lived in late 19th century Montreal, about whom my students and I have done considerable research. The first is the family of Edith Eaton, who's on the right in the slide, top right. Her parents were silk merchant and artist Edward Eaton, and missionary, translator, author, seamstress, and acrobat Atrine Amoy was her mother. They settled with their youngest children in Montreal in 1872. The other family is the family of Osanki, who came to Canada after the head tax was imposed and brought his Chinese wife to Canada in 1893, both of whom Edith wrote about in her journalism. My research on both families has made me realize how scattered the archives about early Chinese families, such as the Eatons and the Ho's, are. So my paper is in part a meditation on Canada's archival neglect of Chinese Canadian families and on how reparations might be made to these particular families and to other people of Chinese ancestry in Canada by gathering up these scattered archives and documenting these families' places in Canada's history. All right. So narrowly defined reparative archival work remediates or contextualizes outdated or harmful language used in archival descriptions and creates descriptions that are accurate, inclusive, and community-centered, drawing on the theories of reparative archive by African American scholars such as Hughes, Watkins, Johnson, and Hartman, and on Chinese Canadian archivists and scholars' work such as Paul Yi, Jin Chao, and others. I use a more expansive definition to signal any work that gathers, restores, preserves, organizes, or creates archives to counter archival neglect and blindness. Historical Chinese in Canada are paradoxically among the most visible and the least visible communities in the archive. Because of over 6 decades of anti-Chinese policies, there are hundreds of thousands of state records about people of Chinese background in Library and Archives Canada, and more records are being found every day. To mention only the best known, the Register of Chinese Immigrants to Canada, sometimes called the Head Tax Register, lists every Chinese immigrant who arrived in Canada beginning in 1885. This register preserves valuable information such as name, age, home village, gender, ship, port of entry, arrival date, intended destination, but it also enacts a kind of violence on those documents, misconstruing information they gave at customs, inconsistently anglicizing their names and the names of their villages, as well as recording in excruciating detail biometric data such as scars, moles, and other features by which immigration officials hope to detect immigration fraud in the absence of photography. When immigrants listed in this registry paid the head tax, they were given a CI-5, Chinese Immigration Certificate number 5, as receipt for payment. In some cases, these receipts are the only records families have of their ancestors. After 1923, when Canada banned all Chinese immigration, the state ramped up its record keeping in order to control, contain, monitor, and intimidate the Chinese through CI-9, CI-28, CI-30, CI-36, CI-45s, CI-49s, CI-49s, and over 40 other types of CI documents. Like the records in the Archive of Slavery, which Sage Hartman has noted rest upon a fundamental founding violence, the Archive of Chinese in Canada also rests on a founding violence. Acknowledging this violence, scholar Lily Cho refers to the CI-9 identity photographs as a form of mass capture. At the same time, traditional repositories in Canada continue to privilege, preserve, and reproduce a predominantly white history, as archivist and author Paul Yee and others have noted, which means that there have been, until very recently, few fonds or collections expressly dedicated to early Chinese in Canada. Archives, museums, and galleries, if they collect and preserve materials relevant to early Chinese, often have not done the research required to understand the value or significance of their holdings. They provide flawed or negligible metadata, and they continue to advance narratives about their holdings that center whiteness. So to take one Montreal example, the McCord Stewart Museum has two 1867 photographs of a Chinese childcare provider, quite likely one of the first Chinese women to live in Canada, because 1867 was very early. But the metadata for these images provide no name. She is defined and cataloged simply as nursemaid to the MacDonald family. Probably MacDonald is a man who served in some diplomatic or military role in Asia before taking on a role in Canada and bringing his family servants with him. The metadata also mentions the photographer, William Notman, who was the celebrated photographer, most of whose subjects were Anglo-Montreal elites. The unidentified young Chinese girl, perhaps another servant, perhaps this older woman's daughter, is acknowledged only as one of the two children in the title, MacDonald's Nursemaid and Children. So these examples make apparent what Hartman calls the disposability of certain lives. I'm tempted to say, at the risk of oversimplifying, that for early Chinese in Canada, the archive primarily consists of state-collected data that dehumanizes and institutionally collected materials with metadata that, by its inaccuracy or incompleteness, also dehumanizes. Finding personal human stories of the earliest Chinese in Canada, stories that might write back to the bureaucratic records collected during the Exclusion Era, or fill in the gaps of the metadata in more traditional repositories, has been challenging. Surviving records of the relationships, aspirations, and lived experiences of the immigrants who came from China, beginning in the mid-19th century, are scattered around the world. There are letters from gold miners and railroad workers sent back to China. There are photographs and other papers that have been preserved by North American descendants. Some materials, typically in Chinese, have been preserved in family association offices, But many of these materials, in the absence of interest from traditional repositories, are at risk as buildings in gentrified Chinatown neighborhoods get torn down and records no one's recognized the value of get thrown out. In an article entitled From Salvage to Strategy, a conversation with Paul Yee on archival consciousness and the Chinese Canadian archival record by archivists Jean Chow and Jennifer Douglas, Yee tells stories about salvaging precious records of Chinese Canadian history from abandoned buildings and even dumpsters in 1970s Vancouver. But as Chow and Douglas insist, we need to do the relational care work to move from salvage to strategy so that the stories of early Chinese in Canada can be preserved and shared. So the remainder of my lecture is about how my scholarship and teaching have found modest ways to contribute to this project. Okay, so as Bob mentioned, my current book project, Intimate Empire, The Story of Sui Sin Far's Family, is a descendant authorized biography of Edith Eaton. For dates, just to situate her, are 1865 to 1914. So it's a biography of her and her family who were active in China, England, and North America before and during the Exclusion Era. The Eatons were an exceptional early Chinese family. Unlike the first Chinese immigrants, gold miners who came to California beginning in the 1840s, and then railroad workers who arrived beginning in the mid-60s, Edith, her British father, Chinese mother, and an older brother came to the East Coast, not the West Coast. My research has determined they arrived in New York right after the Civil War ended, years before anti-Chinese violence would overtake the Western states. The racial gender formation of Eaton's parents' marriage, a Chinese woman marrying a white man, was unusual in America because typically mixed race families were between Chinese men and non-Chinese women. Edith's Shanghai-born, English-educated mother was one of the first Chinese females in North America, and until the 1890s, the Eatons were, as far as I can tell, the only family with Chinese ancestry in Montreal. Edith and many of her siblings were remarkable. So there's her best known, somewhat extremely notorious sister, Winifred, in middle here, problematically, the second from the left, problematically published best-selling Japanese-themed novels under the faux Japanese pen name Anato Watana. I could devote many hours to talking about Winifred, but for now, we should sort of leave her on that slide. She also led Universal Studios' screenwriting department in the 1920s. Her sister to the right, Grace, co-edited Fin de Siècle magazines with her husband, Walter Blackburn Hart, and was an activist lawyer in Illinois suffrage movement. And another sister, Sarah, co-authored with Winifred the first Asian cookbook published in English in North America. I have a picture of Winifred's novel, and so Intimate Empire will use this remarkable family and the connections it had with other Chinese in North America to explore diverse forms of kinship and belonging during the Exclusion Era. Now, Edith is credited with founding Asian North American literature. Although she published periodical fiction, travel writing, memoir, and journalism, she's best known for the one book, Mrs. Spring Fragrance, which collects 37 short stories about Chinese and diasporic Chinese. When she published this in 1912, at the height of Yellow Peril discourse, these stories were considered innovative for their sympathetic depictions of North American Chinatowns, particularly its mothers and children, as well as for her astute commentary on the challenges of being mixed race in America. Her earliest publications, which appeared in late 1880s Montreal periodicals, had titles such as Misunderstood, The Story of a Young Man, Lord Albemarle's seat, and were sentimental, derivative short stories about narcissistic male poet geniuses, Moonlight, etc., that quoted romantic poets and Oscar Wilde. But beginning in 1894, when she was nearly 30, she began to write journalism about and short stories inspired by Montreal's fledgling Chinese community, which included a few hundred men who had settled there after the completion of the railroad, and a few of whom had been able to afford free bring wives from China. Eaton's first Chinese-themed stories, published under her Cantonese pen name Sui Sin Far, were accepted by the editors of regional magazines like California's Land of Sunshine. But in 1902, she began to publish in national periodicals such as Ladies' Home Journal, Youth's Companion, Good Housekeeping, and Century. She also published letters to the editor advocating for the rights of North American Chinese during the Exclusion Era, which led Montreal's Chinese community after her death to erect a monument on her grave, chiseled with characters meaning the righteous one does not forget China. So if you'll permit me now, I'd like to read a few paragraphs from my manuscript that sort of set up a little bit of the archival theme that I'm pursuing. Okay, so whenever she felt lonesome and had accumulated some savings, Edith would convince a railway line to give her passage home in exchange for writing ad copy about her trip. So in November 1906, she quit her stenography job in Seattle, where she lived for 6 years, filled her steamer trunk with everything she owned, moved out of a rooming house, and took the train east to visit family in Montreal. 5 months later, it was April 1907, and she was heading back to the West Coast on a ticket provided by Great Northern Railway. The Oriental Limited was Great Northern's premier transcontinental passenger train, with elegantly furnished cars, leaded windows, and a dining car that Great Northern claimed served the best meals on wheels. The company promised its state-of-the-art locomotives could cover the 2,700 kilometers from St. Paul's, Minnesota, to Seattle in 58 hours. After leaving St. Paul on the morning of April 18th, the train crossed the Mississippi River to Minneapolis via the majestic Grand Stone Arch Bridge. Great Northern's slogan was "See America First," so passengers had spent the afternoon gazing out the windows of the grand observation car at the dramatic bluffs, the spring foliage in the Red River Valley, and after that, endless prairie expanses ready for seeding. Eaton had a timetable handy, so she could identify the towns: St. Cloud, Fergus Falls, Grand Forks, Lakota, some of them little more than post offices amidst the snow-covered wheat fields, as the locomotive barreled past them at 35 miles an hour. Edith also listened to the conversations going on around her. I derived much pleasure from travel in pleasant company. Amidst refreshing scenes, all stations reached at their appointed time, and meals and accommodations for repose most excellent, she had written in 1904 travel. When night fell, passengers read by gas lamps that had recently been installed in Great Northern's ultra-modern cars. But a few hours later, disaster struck. The train had left Grand Forks 3 hours behind and was desperate to make up for lost time. People claimed afterward that when it barreled through the sleepy hamlet of Bartlett around 1 in the morning, the train was going over 60 miles an hour. Survivors remembered feeling a sudden lurch and a jar, and then the engine and 6 cars jumped the track and zigzagged down the embankment. The deafening sound, grinding iron and steel, the crushing and cracking timbers rent the air. The front end of the smoker car jammed under the rear end of the baggage car. When the train came to a full stop, an iron wheel that had driven itself right through the splintered floor of the tourist car spun in the air. Passengers, tossed from their berths, stumbled out of the twisted cars and stood in their nightclothes in damp fields. When someone cried out, "Fire!" One man trapped beneath the debris screamed, begging to be shot before the flames burned him alive. None of the men who raced forward to quench the flames and to rescue people caught under the wreckage remembered the gas tanks hanging beneath the cars. 3 explosions shattered the cabooses' windows, hurled people 40 feet in the air, and woke people up 20 miles away. 6 of the 8 once palatial Oriental line cars were now nothing but a mass of twisted iron rods and steel frames. It was the worst wreck in years. 41-year-old Edith Eaton felt lucky to escape with her life. 5 men and 1 woman had not been so lucky. Their charred torsos with arms and hands burned off and bones protruding through cooked flesh were visible among the wreckage. Amidst all this horror, Edith suddenly remembered her trunk given to a baggage handler earlier that day. Her high-necked blouses, her crocheted lace collars, her long skirts in dark colors, her books, her writing paper, these could all be replaced. But the stories she'd written while visiting her parents, the manuscripts she'd been revising, her author photographs, but most of all, the precious scrapbooks into which she'd carefully preserved early publications, acceptance letters, her first check, evidence of her fledgling career. All of these were now nothing but smoldering ash. When Edith made it back to Puget Sound a few days later, she returned to her old job at the City of Seattle law offices, fed stationery into a typewriter, and began typing. "Dear Sir," she wrote the editor of the Century, "through a wreck on the Great Northern Railway last Sunday night, I've lost everything save life. My trunk containing all my manuscripts, scrapbooks having been destroyed in the fire. Would you therefore kindly send me a copy of the letter in which you accepted my story, Chinese Boy Girl, also a couple copies of the magazine in which the story appears? Thank you in anticipation." Years later, she was still trying to replace what had been lost. Writing to the editor of Land of Sunshine in 1912, she asked whether you have anywhere a picture or so of mine. All of mine were burned in a railway fire, and I can't find it again. So whenever I discuss my book projects with other biographers, their first question is, where are these papers? They picture gray, acid, metal-edged storage boxes of papers of celebrated authors that had been donated by family and collectors, tidily cataloged by special collections librarians. But when Edith died at 49, she left behind no diaries, no manuscripts, no scrapbooks, not a single letter to or from a family member or friend. Her only surviving correspondence are a handful of letters she exchanged with Land of Sunshine and Century editors, plus an obliging reply she sent to a young man who asked for her autograph. She left behind her book, plus a couple dozen uncollected stories and works of journalism that scholars found in periodicals decades later. But without papers, without any information about her childhood, about her Chinese mother, about the Chinese people she knew, or anyone else she may have befriended, it's difficult to understand who she is and what led her, after effectively passing as white for almost 30 years, to suddenly assume a Cantonese name and write for and about diasporic Chinese. In the absence of her papers, she comes across as isolated, unique, exceptional, without family, without peers, without community. So I realized early in my research that my book was not just going to be a biography of Edith or a biography of one family. The story I wanted to tell was both intimate and global. It was both a biography and a history of some well-known historical events in which a group of individuals played personal but significant roles. And because I could not simply consult her bonds, her papers at an archive, I needed to assemble her scattered archive and the archive of her family myself. So here are the beginnings of that archive. About Edith's mother at Chinamoy, I was able to find census and baptismal records, missionary memoirs, court transcripts, and etching, letters, playbills, posters. I think I have a few more there. And theater reviews that are scattered in newspapers across US and Canadian, British, and Hong Kong libraries. These documents tell us a great deal about Chun Roy, who in previous scholarship is a vague figure. I discovered that she was purchased as a toddler by the leaders of a famous troupe of Chinese acrobats with whom she toured the world in the 1850s, dancing on tight ropes for gold rush miners. That she ran away from her owner at age 9 after being made to serve as the target of his knife-throwing stunt. That's the image up right there. That missionaries arranged for her to interpret at Old Bailey Courthouse for sailors whose Chinese dialects no British translators knew well. That she returned to China as a missionary, and she later wrote a serialized autobiographical novel under her married name, Grace Eaton, fragments of which were located by my graduate student, Sydney Williams. I also uncovered that Eaton's father, who was born in Macclesfield, a Cheshire town that was the western end of the ancient Silk Road, during the Exclusion Era, helped scores of Chinese men enter the US, some via Roxham Road, the crossing in the eastern townships that's been in the news recently. Immigration files, arrest records, jailbreak stories, and more reveal that he was arrested twice for being the kingpin of a network he described as an underground railroad to help Chinese return to their businesses in New York and Massachusetts after they'd come back from China only to find themselves lacking the paperwork that was suddenly required by the state. Edward escaped from jail using a file baked in cake by one of his daughters, but that's a story for another time. Talk to me about movie rights, on that. But most importantly, I unearthed over 150 works by Edith that she published in over 60 magazines in Canada, the US, and Jamaica. These include a wide range of genres: didactic tales for children, middlebrow, sensation fiction, travel writing, autobiography, translations, journalism, not all of which is sciences. Most significant for me among these findings are her uncollected journalism and life writing that provide us with early first-person depictions of the rich Chinese communities among whom she worked in Montreal, Seattle, California, and Boston. I know the Chinese in all characters, she writes in Leaves from the Mental Portfolio of a Eurasian, her best-known memoir. Merchants, laundrymen, laborers, servants, smugglers, and smuggled, also as Sunday school scholars and gamblers. But Eaton might also have said she knew Chinese women in all characters, because she was what she describes elsewhere as a lady reporter. She was given access to Chinese families since it was, she writes, it was not considered proper by the Chinese for a woman to be on terms of acquaintanceship, any man but her husband, not even her husband's friends. So with this access, she wrote scores of articles about Chinese women, their engagements, marriages, friendships, births of their children, holiday celebrations, apartments, businesses. Much of the information she outlines there, she repurposed in her fiction. So these scattered materials reveal so much, but primarily that Edith and her family were at the center of a broad network of overseas Chinese, befriending early arrivals, serving as missionaries to them, translating for them, putting them in touch with legal advisors, defending them in the media, and in Edith's case, writing about them. So last year, I taught a course on digital methods for literary study that used Eaton and her sister's works as portals into early Chinese Canadian history and literature. Assignments required students to use digital tools to research and create 3 public-facing projects: a place-based project that asked students to present research on Chun Amoy's troops acrobatic tour via story maps, a text-based project trained students to use GitHub, XML, and the schema developed by the Textual Encoding Initiative to prepare a digital edition of the screenplay, and then a people-based assignment asked students to research and write blog posts about people whom Edith had written about in Montreal journalism. So now I'd like to share students' findings about families for this last assignment. This assignment was inspired in part by scholarship from the African diaspora that's recovered Black lives by layering historically situated experiences of individuals over what can seem to be a pretty abstract and anonymous Black Atlantic history. So this scholarship includes public-facing websites such as the Colored Conventions Project, Remembering the Middle Passage, etc., which have assembled and interpreted early records of Black families. The goal of the people-based assignment was to have students do something parallel, that is, to populate a somewhat anonymous Asian Pacific with personal stories of the people Edith mentioned in her 1890s journalism. Eaton published her first article about Montreal's Chinatown in the May 1894 issue of the Montreal Witness, after she and her mother had, at the encouragement of their Protestant minister, visited the wives of boarding house operators Wing Sing and Sam Kee. As you'll see, in her early work before taking up her Cantonese pen name, she positions herself as the Orientalist, ethnographer, and voyeur, encountering the exotic other. This article was sensationally titled Girl's Name, Montreal, and the opening sentence attempts to make a startling revelation: there is a slave in Montreal. After introducing several key businessmen in Montreal's Chinatown, the article goes on to describe two women and one group. Mr. Wing Sing, she writes, has a wife. Not many people can see Mrs. Wing Sing. She's very exclusive. She received me very graciously, her round face beaming with smiles. She's considered to be a beauty. With Mrs. Wing Sing was Mrs. Sam Kee, a bride of a few months, and a little girl about 10 years old, both of whom were in native dress. Sam Kee's bride is but a lass of the yet, and when I first made her appearance, she was demolishing with great gusto some brisk rice. After shaking hands, she disappeared. As to the child, she is a slave. Well, poor thing, she belongs to Mrs. Sam Kee, came over with her from China. She's treated more like a sister than a slave. Indeed, it is the custom in China to look upon slaves as family. So, despite the Orientalizing gaze and her ignorance about many Chinese customs, the details she provides offered students valuable details that they could pursue. Students, including Victoria College alumna, Delaney Anderson, thank you for sending her my way, followed up. They worked as a team, they pooled their skills. Some of them spoke French, some read Chinese, some knew Montreal's geography, some were excellent digital researchers, thanks to Angela Westerholm. And they found out more about all the people mentioned in Edith's journalism. So without knowing Mrs. Sam Kee's name, a maiden name, or the name of the 10-year-old who came with her, students weren't sure that they could find them in the head tax records, but they did. Two females from the same village traveling in 1893, when most of the people coming into Canada were male, were easy to find in the digitized version of this register that my colleague can view assembled. So students learned that the woman whom Eaton refers to as Mrs. Sam Kee is listed as Ju Nui, or we could say Chu Nui, because that was a different spelling. She came at age 20 from Lai Yi Gong in Guangdong via Hong Kong aboard a CPR vessel. The register notes she arrived in Vancouver September 7th, was 4'10", and had pitted skin on her left cheekbone and a scar at the center of her forehead, mostly biometric information, not of human interest. The details, drawing on details in the article, students were able to locate the newspaper account of the wedding, accompanying sketch, details about home, French and English journalism, about her, including records of illness and death. They located a photograph with two children in the cord, one of the children turns out to be George, the first child, Chinese child born in Montreal. They pursued information about George and found details about his completion of the moon ceremony. That's when their hair gets cut, baby's hair gets cut a month after their birth. His performance in school, his baptism, his illness and death months before his mom died. They also found information about Junui's husband, Sun Ki, and people from Boston and New York's Chinese communities who visited his family, who've been mentioned in other journals. The girl shows up in the record as Jiguli and is identified as from the same village and as Junui's sister. With the same family name, she may have been a relative given as a wedding gift to serve as an nanny to the new wife's growing family. Students found an article that referred to the girl's nickname, and they found a photograph of a girl described by the record as Miss Song Ki, who is probably a Jiguli. Following Sage Hartman's advice to do more than recount the violence that deposited these traces in the archive, my students then wrote stories about these people that refashioned disfigured lives. I encouraged them to use what Hartman calls critical fabulation if they couldn't find enough documented information about the people they were researching. But in fact, they found more than enough to write about these people once they'd assembled these scattered sources. The students wrote WordPress posts about these people and thought their assignment was complete, but after they shared them on social media, students received help from an unlikely research assistant, Facebook Hive Mind. I'm sure you also use this source. We heard from Nancy Rao, who's a Rutgers University scholar of Cantonese opera, who recognized the photo of Mrs. Song Ki because her husband is a descendant. So she put us in touch with his cousin, Lawrence Lee, who explained that the family name had changed from Ho to Ha or Hor, just sort of different ways of romanizing what English people were hearing, Chinese people say, which gave students even more search terms. And the students shared what they found with the Lees, and the Lees shared what they knew, photographs and wedding invitation, many anecdotes. And we learned how when the law suspected Ho Sung Ki of smuggling Chinese into the US, he moved to Western Canada to find work as a labor recruiter under a different name. And then after his wife and George died, the surviving children, whose English names we figured out were inspired by the names of Eaton and her siblings. These children were adopted by a Quebec hardware merchant, probably a client of Eaton's eldest brother, who was VP of the foremost hardware manufacturer in Canada. So whereas Eaton's article on its own revealed very little about the family life, but gave us some clues, the students' research identified the Song Ki family as part of a network of diasporic Chinese, where we had only fragmented, isolated individuals. We now had community, and after hearing from descendants, an understanding of family over 140 years in Canada. The details they uncovered demonstrate that the Eatons were close to this Chinese family, and they make it very likely that this family and others whom Edith met through them inspired her earliest short stories. Meanwhile, the students and I were invited to curate a pop-up exhibit at Montreal's Chinatown House that drew on their research for a Chinatown Reimagined Forum that was coordinated by Fondation Jia. Jia means home in Chinese. So students absorbed the new information provided by the Lee family, prepared and translated excerpts of their blogs, obtained permissions, did publicity, and designed banners with QR codes that would lead viewers to a digital archive. There's the exhibit, and on the left is kind of a digital link, and they're back there, and you can do the QR code stuff yourself. So all the sources are on the digital platform. Delaney and Amanda, Victoria alum, and Amanda attended the opening exhibit where they met with descendants of the people about whom they've written. And please have a look at the exhibit. And if you detect any errors in the languages you know, please let me know, especially Chinese, okay? Here I'd like to acknowledge all the help I got here. So these are the students who did the work, and these are descendants and scholars and designers who were incredibly helpful as well. My students did reparative archive work, pairing their own research and the knowledge of descendants to flesh out family stories and build an archive of findings. My hope is that Fondation Mondiale can use the research done in our own efforts to protect the tangible and intangible cultural heritage of Montreal's Chinatown, and that the McCord can be persuaded to revise their metadata. On Wednesday, I'm hosting a workshop to train UT students here, or it's in the Pratt Library, at 1 o'clock to learn story maps, and they'll work on the acrobatic tour, expanding it to Great Britain. And later this week, I'm hoping to visit all the amazing archives here in Toronto, UT, and Toronto Public Library's archives of this topic. All of which is to say, work is ongoing. I'm learning all the time, and hoping I can continue to help students do reparative work. Okay, conclusion. I'm afraid I'm going to conclude my lecture with another anecdote about an archive going up in smoke. So one of the earliest first-person accounts of Chinese life in Canada, and one of two first-person accounts of Chinese workers on a transcontinental railroad project, was apparently a diary kept for over 50 years by Duke Sanlong, who came to Canada in 1867 and worked on the CPR. Unfortunately, after surviving for decades, his 7-notebook diary was destroyed by fire, although no one is sure about the details. Like the story I told about Eaton's trunk, this anecdote is about loss, but it's also about repair. Why? Because the Family Association preserved Duke Sang's diaries for decades after his death, because his granddaughter, Wanda Joy Ho, borrowed them in 1966 for an SFU sociology course she was taking, because her uncles helped translate 59 pages, and because editor David McElroy recently worked with Wanda Joy to bring out an edition of the surviving pages that describe what Duke Sang experienced, witnessed, and contemplated on both sides of the Pacific for over decades, from his father's murder to the birth of his daughter. It's by no means complete. Much more research needs to be done to understand Duke Sang's place and experience. That said, these 59 pages with additional research notes and some corrections provided by Zhangping Chen provide rare insights into the experiences of Chinese immigrants in 19th century Canada. Fire destroys, but archivists Jean Chow and Jennifer Douglas call reparative archival, what June and Jennifer Douglas call reparative archival care work can preserve. So as I mentioned at the start, 2023 was a big year for the Chinese Canadian Archives as the community commemorated 100 years since the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Era. Thanks to the efforts of Catherine Clement, curator of the Paper Trail exhibit at the New Chinese Canadian Museum in Vancouver, and June Chow, previously restricted Chinese immigration records were opened to the public at Library and Archives Canada. As a result, more records about Chinese immigration have been made available through agencies including LAC, Canadian Heritage, UBC Library, Family Search, and Ancestry.com. Immigration records at Library Archives Canada have become more discoverable. For example, restricted case files can now be requested by descendants and others. A group of community historians who met in the Genealogy for Asian Canadians Facebook page, sorry, that's the Paper Trail exhibit in the museum. The Facebook group founded by genealogist Linda Yip, who's a descendant of the Yipsang family whose building houses the museum, has begun to index and transcribe CI9s, certificates issued whenever Chinese in Canada wish to travel outside Canada, so descendants can locate photographs and learn more about their ancestors. Because of these developments, descendants and scholars will be able to reread these state archives, which enacted such violence, but against the grain, or as historian Marisa Fuentes has called it, along the bias, in order to piece together stories to narrate and counter history. So I want to end with an image. I'm planning to start an intimate empire with that I've been pondering for over a year now. It sort of keeps meaning more to me than I logically recognized when I first loved it. So this 19th century button is from the collection of the Silk Museum in Macclesfield, the Cheshire silk mill town where Edith and her father were born. It seems an apt image of the intimate empire I'm exploring, made locally, perhaps even familiarly, by a man who cut down wood at Holland's Green, perhaps even someone from the Eaton family, and then a wife or sister or daughter who wrapped in thread the wooden disc he made, and then someone else who stitched the button onto an article of clothing worn close to the body. This button is an image of intimacy. But the button also has a global history. It was made from silk, harvested thousands of miles away, loaded into a cooper at Shanghai, where Edith's mother was born, shipped to Liverpool or London, and then by canal boat to Macclesfield, where the raw silk was thrown. This button crystallizes the global movements of the 19th century that linked England to China and that made subject positions such as the one Edith Eaton occupied possible. So for me, this button functions as a kind of micro-archive of the Eaton family's early history. Fastening, binding, linking, connecting, just as a button can fasten together sides of an article of clothing, I imagine this button making families, such as the Eatons and the Hopes, but also connecting descendants, students, scholars, and librarians who together can do the work of archival reparations. Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much. What a wonderful mix of research, pedagogy. Your storytelling ability is also very, very good. I was hoping that train would explode. We've got some time for questions, comments. I don't think there's gonna be any complaints for our reception. Please.
Yes, any relationship with the Eaton family here, like the store?
No.
No, okay.
That was my question. While you think, I will ask you about just the concept of metadata, right? Because we think about it as something that's so modern and, you know, we're warned now to take it off of our photos. What's that doing to the future artists?
Well, metadata is only as good as the people who preserve the original information, which is what makes it so unsatisfying to go back to older materials. So if you're working with anything contemporary, sort of since we started thinking metadata, yay, it's all complete. But if you're going back, I mean, if you've gone to the British Library and tried to do any research before they lost everything, you will know that, you know, there's not great metadata on the older sources. So researchers are sort of at a loss.
Yes.
What would you say is like the role of like community work in bringing reparative archival work into society, into the communities?
Start the question, the beginning of the question on this. What would you say?
What would you say like community cultural work? What would you say is like community cultural work, supporting community cultural work and like social work, like just like facilitating to people who can activate archives in making sure reparative archival work can reach communities. How do you bring the archive to the community?
Yeah, that's a huge question, really important. I think it's sort of a circle. You've got to build community and encourage them to share. because sometimes the only stuff we have is in family collections, and families might have heard stories, but not have the sort of historical frame to situate and understand what they've heard. You've got to encourage them by being archives that are receptive to community contributions, make a place for them, make space for them, preserve them, do the homework to look up the metadata and sort of figure out how to archive these things. And then you have to find ways to share. Fortunately, these sort of open source web platforms are a good way to share. And I think many museums and exhibiting galleries and things are starting to be more responsible to a richer community than they acknowledged earlier. But it takes a lot of care. I mean, I really am inspired by this idea of care work. It's a very emotional, intimate, trust-based exchange. And so if you don't have that, the exchange won't happen.
I'm quite puzzled by just the concept of reparative archives, because archives are preserving the old, and reparative is changing what's the archive.
Yeah, well, it is, they are old things, but which file folders we put them in, what we call them, and how we make them available, and how we make them discoverable is something new. So we can do that, right? So nobody's saying, let's make all the racial slurs that Winifred used in her work disappear. I mean, that could be a project for some wish, but just rethinking so that somebody who enters an archive can find what they're looking for, respectfully filed and framed in an intelligent way.
So kind of like creating a source of terms to use for search.
Yeah, like the metadata for that photograph I showed, nursemaid and children of, McDonald's children, they don't know anything about that person, but they could. It's not that hard to find people named McDonald in Canada in 1867. I mean, obviously there are quite a few of them. I don't think it's that many, but do some homework. Find out who that person is, and actually if it is 1867, because I sort of don't think it is 1867. But if somebody gave it to the archive and said, oh, this is 1867, somebody wrote down 1867. So it's just about being more responsible and paying attention to the materials you have and recognizing their value.
I see. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not the person who knows that much about what the archive people do. There are other people in this room who can answer those questions better, but that's my sense from how I'm engaging in this archive repositories.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Ian?
Thank you for incredibly fine talk. My question was somewhat related to that. You mentioned how the archive rests on founding violence and the state data dehumanizes. So drawing upon that, what is the role of the family archives and how do we approach family archives indeed? Because, sorry, as you were talking, I was really thinking how I was kind of expecting, and towards the end, you brought in the families, etc. So I've always been very attached to family objects and photos and things from here, etc. So are those archives more humane by nature, less? How do we approach that one?
Yeah, the descendants are really invaluable here, and sort of the third term, I guess. We've got the scholars, we've got the archives, and we've got family. Chinese communities in Canada, many of them have family association buildings, and those buildings organize many resources, usually Chinese language, about particular names, the Wang family or the Chu family, Lin. And those are great, and we should be working with we should be encouraging and helping preserve those archives before they burn down. But also they have connections with individuals. So for example, when we did this exhibit in Montreal, descendants of the Eaton family, two of whom are here today, Elizabeth and Frank, three. I haven't met that guy, but Elizabeth and Frank and Jim Rooney, who are descendants of Winifred, and also descendants of the Ho family came, and they gave us some of the photographs we didn't have, and they felt so honored, but my students felt so honored about the sharing, right? So just make opportunities like that to share, and then those family objects can be shared. And I think there's less violence going on there. There might be misunderstanding going on there sometimes, but they're great resources for sure.
Great. Any other questions? Yes. Please.
I don't know, thanks so much for your talk. When you talk about the course that you run at UBC, and the structure seems to be like you give the students a historical figure with some loose whatever, and then set them off to look, and then I guess in the sense that Edith Eaton was like, at some point they struck the living descendants. I'm wondering if you would ever consider, or if UBC, behavioral research and research ethics would ever allow you to start with actual descendants first who are looking to answer a question, because that's where the genealogy is coming from. They have pressing questions, they have gaps, and their inability to actually find the records is actually where that trauma is coming from, and where that reparative work needs to be done, at that like first step to start, just kind of at that baseline. And there is definitely, trauma in like records and Chinese immigration records and Lebanon, Canada, when you can't find your ancestor, when these are like rich, supposedly very rich, very comprehensive genealogical resources, and they're a maze or like there's a certain kind of like so does UBC, and would that ever be a model that you could work from, working with living descendants? Questions they need answered.
Because I'm in an English department, I had to kind of sneak all this work in. And so I thought, can I just organize it around things that Edith Eaton wrote? Don't you? And I said, okay. So I started there for that reason, just from a disciplinary historical reason, and also my training and expertise, I could start there. But you are totally right that the other direction is a wonderful model. I think UBC is open to that. I think the history department and the Asian Canadian Asian migration program are open to that. And I have been working with individual students kind of in that capacity, and just found a great grandfather the other day, because I love that head tax record. I feel like, give me a challenge, I will find that person. So I'm doing that a little bit, but sort of off the side of my desk. But now that I've taught this course and feel like I know a little bit more how to go about it, maybe we could do that backwards. Because I think you're right that the trauma is real. And when I teach Sui Sin Far, students come right up to me. Please, please, please help me find my ancestors. So I get it. Thanks for that.
Well, you mentioned the CI documents. Is that something the Canadian government is holding, that you may sort of freedom of information to get your hands on some books?
Yep.
That could be.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah, you'll get them a little bit redacted depending on which person fulfills your request, but they absolutely are available. And the Facebook group that Linda Yip leads, the Past Presence website, has lots of guidance about ways in, how to find, how to ask. Yeah, hundreds of thousands and more being discovered all the time by Jean. And we just asked the last question, and that would be
I'm gonna ask about technology, like AI. Is AI now part of this sort of scouring these documents? Can they read, like, for some people who work in modern stuff, we're lucky to have things typed out for us, right?
Yeah.
Anyone here who's a medievalist will roll their eyes at the ability of modernists to read anything. But I was just thinking about how potentially technology is going to help with that.
Yeah, ChatGPT didn't help any of my students write good essays on it.
Did it make up any
It was
ancestors?
tempting, but they found nothing about the particular passage, right? I think that's coming, but I think these are so weird, these little odd things, like a little magpie here. They're odd, they're under different names, like the Chinese naming errors make it very weird. But over time, I think AI will help or hinder us in this research.
Well, if there's no any other questions, then please join me in thanking Mary for a wonderful talk. Since you've all been such a great audience, you're all invited to the reception after this, and any students here, this is your chance, reception, to follow the magic words. I'd also like to pitch Mary's workshop on 1 p.m. on Wednesday, and then the NFC is also lucky to have 2 visitors here this week. We also have Dr. Guillermo Colon Montero will be giving a talk on over tourism on Friday. So thank you again for coming. I'm really happy with the turnout, the great questions, and of course, the wonderful talk. So please, let's mingle in the atrium and have some food and some drink. Thank you.